The first ship appeared over Karachi at 3:47 in the morning, when the city was still half asleep and the fishermen were just pushing their boats into the Arabian Sea. Nobody fired. Nobody ran. For 11 seconds, 8 million people looked up at something the size of a small moon hanging in the dark like a second sun that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Then it fired. The Karachi crater is 4 kilometers wide now. You can see it from orbit. The aliens left it there on purpose. Not because they needed to destroy the port, not because they were aiming for anything strategic. The crater was a message, a comma, the opening punctuation of a sentence they planned to finish at their leisure. They had been watching us for 60 years. They knew our weapons. They knew our governments. They knew how long it took humanity to stop arguing and start agreeing, and they had built their entire invasion timetable around that number. They were patient. They were precise. They were, by every metric their civilization had developed across 4,000 years of interstellar conquest, completely, professionally certain that this was already over. They had never met Spectre Unit. Nobody had. That was the point. This is not a story about humanity rising up. Humanity was already rising. This is a story about 12 people who were built for exactly one purpose: to walk into the kind of situation that ends civilizations and walk back out carrying the receipt. The aliens picked the wrong species. That part is true, but more specifically, more precisely, more catastrophically for the Vreth Dominion and everything they thought they knew about carbon-based warfare, they picked the wrong 12 people. What happened next took 9 days. The Vreth are still trying to understand it. The thing about the end of the world is that it arrives on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday. Not a Tuesday that announces itself with red skies or prophetic dreams or the kind of atmosphere of pressure that makes old women touch their knees and say something is coming. Just a Tuesday in October where the air in Geneva smells like rain and the UN cafeteria is serving its mediocre pasta carbonara, and a mid-level data analyst named Priya Mehta is at her desk on the 4th floor arguing with a vending machine about a bag of pretzels it refused to release. The vending machine won. The pretzels hung there, diagonal, mocking her. And then every screen in the building went white. Not the blue of a crash system. Not the black of a power failure. White. The specific, sourceless white of something broadcasting on every frequency at once, overriding the carrier's signals the way a freight train overrides a bicycle that made a very bad choice. Priya turned from the vending machine. Her coffee was still in her hand. She didn't put it down for the next 6 hours, not because she forgot about it, but because her hands needed something to hold on to, and the cup was the only candidate. The signal lasted 4 minutes and 31 seconds. It played on every screen on Earth simultaneously: televisions, phones, hospital monitors, the departures board at Frankfurt Airport, the ancient CRT television in a barbershop in Lagos that had been on the same channel since 2019. Every screen, every surface capable of emitting light. Even the neon sign outside a ramen shop in Sapporo cycled through the message 3 times before it burned out. The message was simple because they wanted it to be understood. They were that confident. A single geometric shape, a perfect octahedron rotating slowly, and beneath it a sequence of numbers that every mathematician on Earth would later agree translated to one thing: a countdown. 60 hours. And then an image. The Karachi crater. Already happened. Already done. The message was not a threat. A threat implies you have the option to comply. This was a schedule. They were letting humanity know when the next comma was coming, not because they were asking for negotiation, but because they wanted the 60 hours of panic. They had studied human psychology. They knew what 60 hours of certain, impending death does to a civilization's decision-making infrastructure. They were right about the panic. They miscalculated everything else. Colonel Maravas got the call at 4:02 a.m., 17 minutes after the signal began. She was already awake. She had been awake for 3 days running a training cycle in the Atacama Desert that she would later describe in her after-action report as moderately useful. She was eating a protein bar over a topographic map, and Her satellite phone rang with a tone she had programmed herself, a tone she had never expected to hear outside of a test. A single long pulse, then 3 short ones, then silence. She put down the protein bar. She didn't finish it. Someone would find it later, half-eaten on the map, sitting directly on top of what had been the Chilean border, and they would photograph it because humans do that. They photograph the small, ordinary things that existed in the last normal moment before everything changed. The tone meant Spectre was being activated. Spectre did not exist on any official document above a classification level that most 4-star generals had never been cleared to see. It was not in any budget that any oversight committee had reviewed. It was funded through a mechanism so bureaucratically obscure that the 3 people who understood it fully were all retired, and 2 of them were dead. Spectre's existence had been authorized by a joint decision of 7 nations in the aftermath of a different disaster. Not alien, not supernatural, just the ordinary catastrophic kind that happens when 12 non-state actors acquire the same weapons technology simultaneously, and for cities learn what that means in the space of one afternoon. After that afternoon, 7 governments sat in a room for 9 days and agreed on 2 things. First, that the world needed a unit that operated below the threshold of politics, law, and diplomacy. Second, that such a unit, if it ever became publicly known, would be the greatest scandal in the history of democratic governance. Both of those things were still true. They activated Spectre anyway. There were 12 of them. Not because 12 was a mystical number. Not because 12 divided evenly into 4 3-person fire teams, though it did, and they used that structure. 12 because after 7 years of selection, training, washout, psychological evaluation, reselection, and the kind of field assessment that doesn't get written up because writing it up would require explaining what the field assessment involved. 12 people remained who met every criterion. The criterion list was 47 items long. Item 1 was combat effectiveness. Items 2 through 46 were everything else. Languages, trauma tolerance, cognitive flexibility under oxygen deprivation, the ability to make a decision in 4 seconds that a general with a full staff would take 4 days to make, and the willingness to carry that decision quietly in the part of the brain where humans store things they don't talk about at dinner. Item 47 was the one that ended most candidacies. It simply read, will not break. Not won't break under torture. Not won't break under fear. Those were items 18 and 23 respectively. Item 47 was more specific and more difficult to test for. It meant, when everything you train for turns out to be wrong, when a map is useless and the intelligence is fiction and the objective has become something none of your models predicted, will you adapt fast enough to matter, or will you freeze for the 2 seconds that gets everyone killed? 12 people passed. They came from 9 countries, 5 militaries, and 1 organization that officially did not exist, and which Mara Voss refused to name even in classified documentation, writing only prior service, non-standard in the relevant box. She was one of the 12. She was also the one in command, not because she was the most lethal. That was a genuinely contested title that changed depending on the week and the weapon system, but because in 7 years of training together, whenever a situation became maximally complicated and everyone needed someone to be the still point in the middle of the spinning, they all looked at Mara. She had never once looked like she minded. The 12 of them assembled at a facility in central Norway that did not appear on any satellite image because it had been built under a mountain, and the mountain was on a restricted flight path that pilots didn't question, because questioning restricted flight paths in Norway was the kind of thing that generated paperwork nobody wanted to file. They arrived over 6 hours, in groups of 2 or 3, via different routes. No one saw them leave, wherever they'd been. They simply appeared in the briefing room, one by one, like variables resolving in an equation. The last to arrive was Jin-Soo Park, who came in from Seoul, still wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a university sweatshirt, running shoes, carrying a paper bag of convenience store kimbap. He sat down, set the bag in the middle of the table, and said, "Eat something, we're going to need it," which was the most words he had spoken voluntarily in any social setting in 8 months. Everyone ate. The briefing officer was a British intelligence analyst named Carver, who had the specific energy of a man who had seen too many things to be frightened by new ones, but was making a genuine effort for the sake of his blood pressure. He put the alien signal on the main screen. He played it twice. He said, 60 hours from transmission. We are now at 56. The Karachi event used an energy weapon of unknown mechanism fired from the primary vessel. The vessel is currently in geosynchronous orbit over the Bay of Bengal. There are 4 additional vessels in varying orbits, 2 polar, 2 equatorial. All 5 are maintaining communication silence since the signal. He paused. He looked at his notes. He looked up. They have not responded to any attempted contact. They have not fired again. They are waiting. For the countdown, Mara said. Yes. What do we have on their biology? Limited. Spectroscopic analysis of atmospheric byproducts from the ships suggests a methane-oxygen mixed environment, but trace gases indicate they can tolerate standard Earth atmosphere for short periods. Thermal imaging through the hull of the secondary vessels shows mass distribution consistent with bilateral symmetry, upright locomotion. Roughly 2 meters. They breathe. They eat. They have a communication structure that implies hierarchical command. The primary vessel issues. The secondary vessels respond. Cut the head, said Tomas Reyes from the end of the table. Not a question. The primary vessel is the target, yes. If command and control is sufficiently centralized, disabling or eliminating the command structure on the primary vessel creates the possibility of fleet paralysis or retreat. Possibility, said Lena Brandt. Yes, possibility. She nodded once. Possibilities were what they worked with. How do we get there, Mara said. Carver pulled up the next slide. The room went quiet in a very specific way. The way of people who are looking at a plan that is objectively insane and are mentally running the numbers to see if insane clears the bar of possible. The plan involved 3 stages. First, a ballistic insertion package, a heavily shielded 4-person module designed to survive a launch trajectory that mimicked orbital debris, riding the slipstream of existing space junk until it reached the outer hull of the primary vessel. The math on this had been run by 4 independent teams, and the consensus survival probability across all 4 teams averaged out to 61%, which Carver had decided to present as within acceptable parameters, and which the room received in silence. Second, hull breach and internal penetration using a cutting tool that had been developed for a completely different classified program, and which had never been tested on alien alloys. Third, find a command structure. Eliminate it. Get out. Get out how, said Diallo Kuwait, who asked operational questions the way other people breathed, automatically, without interrupting anything else. Carver looked at his notes for slightly too long. That is the component of the plan still under development, he said. Copy that, said Diallo, and he reached across the table and took another piece of kimbap. They had 56 hours. They used 48 of them. Not sleeping, or not sleeping much. Sleeping when the body demanded it, and stopping when the brain was done, which for most of them was somewhere between 2 and 4 hours, depending on how well they'd learned to weaponize REM cycles, which was item 31 on the criterion list. The rest of the time was studying the alien signal, frame by frame, extracting whatever structural information was encoded in the geometry. The hull composition analysis, the thermal maps, the trajectory models. Jinsu spent 14 hours building a topology of the primary vessel's interior based on nothing but thermal gradient inference and a set of assumptions about structural engineering that he wrote out in a notebook in 3 languages because his brain moved faster than any one of them could contain. When he was done, he pinned the notebook pages to the wall in a sequence and stood back and looked at it and said, "This is probably wrong in 12 places," and then circled those 12 places and ranked them by how likely the wrongness was to kill them. That was the map they used. Mara watched her team work and felt the thing she always felt in the hours before a mission, the thing she'd never found the right word for in any of her 6 languages. It wasn't calm. It wasn't focus. It was more like the moment a lens clicks into a socket. Everything's slightly blurred by motion suddenly, snapping to a sharpness that includes its own edges. She knew this feeling. She trusted it. It had kept her alive in places where the alternative was very final. The world outside the mountain was experiencing the 56 hours very differently. Governments convened emergency sessions and adjourned them without decisions. Populations alternated between mass prayer and mass purchasing of canned goods in a pattern that repeated every 8 hours. Two nations launched nuclear weapons at the primary vessel, one on hour 4, one on hour 22. Neither reached it. The ship's point defense system, if that's what it was, handled both without what the tracking stations could identify as any particular effort. The city of Manila was evacuated on the basis of a rumor that turned out to be wrong. The rumor traveled faster than the correction by a factor of roughly 11 to 1, which was historically consistent. Three governments, in the chaos of the first day, independently rediscovered the existence of Spectre, not through intelligence, but through the specific bureaucratic archaeology that happens when panicking administrators start pulling at funding threads to find anything at all that might be relevant. All three governments were quietly informed by a fourth government that Spectre was active, that it was proceeding, and that the best thing the three governments could do was continue their public emergency protocols and not make any calls to the number they'd found. All three governments agreed. Then, all three governments spent the next 40 hours being too frightened to do anything else, which was, from Spectre's operational perspective, the ideal outcome. 8 hours before the countdown ended, the four-person insertion module sat on its launch rail in a silo that had been built for a different kind of war and repurposed for this one. Mara, Jinsu, Diallo, and Lena were inside it wearing suits that were a generation beyond anything publicly acknowledged and still not designed for what they were about to do. The suits were designed for vacuum and re-entry. The alien hull breach scenario was a field modification. Most of the modifications had been Lena's idea. Lena's ideas had a consistent record of working about 90% of the time, which was better than most ideas had any right to be. The remaining 8 were in 2 separate modules on 2 separate launch rails. The plan had redundancy built in the way all plans should, but rarely do. Not the optimistic redundancy of if plan A fails we try plan B, but the structural redundancy of a spider web, where cutting one thread redistributes the load, and the whole thing holds. If the first module was destroyed, the second and third still had the mission profile. If 2 modules were destroyed, the third still had a version of it. If all 3 were destroyed, the mission had failed, and that outcome was also in the plan, sitting in a sealed document in Carver's safe, titled in the dry language of intelligence bureaucracy, Contingency, Total Loss. Nobody talked about the sealed document. It existed the way a lot of necessary things existed, acknowledged without being named, understood without being spoken. Module check, Mara said. 3 voices came back in sequence. Diallo, Jinsu, Lena, each one a single word. Ready. Mara looked at the countdown in the corner of her visor. The alien countdown. 7 hours, 43 minutes. Launch in 30, she said. She did not say good luck. She did not say anything about honor or history or what they were doing for humanity. Those were things other people said in other situations. Mara had learned a long time ago that the best thing a commander could do for her people in the 30 seconds before impact was to be the calmest thing in their auditory field. She breathed. Slow. Even. The module launched. Outside, in the dark above the atmosphere, the 5 alien vessels hung in their orbits like punctuation waiting to finish its sentence. Inside the largest one, in chambers no human I had ever seen, the Vreth command structure was monitoring its countdown, checking its instruments, reviewing its projection for the 3rd time because the projections were perfect, and reviewing them again was simply the habit of a civilization that had never once been surprised. The debris field around the primary vessel was thick enough. The insertion module was small enough. The trajectory was precise enough. 61%, the analyst had said. The module didn't know about the 61%. It just fell upward in the dark toward the ship. The hull of the Vreth primary vessel was the color of old iron and, approximately 3 times as hard. Lena had known this before they launched. She had run the spectrographic data through 4 different material modeling programs, and all 4 had come back with compositions that did not match any alloy in human metallurgical history. She had taken that information and the cutting tool and spent 11 hours in the facility workshop making modifications that she had not been asked to make and that no one had authorized and that she had not mentioned to Mara because Mara would have approved them, and approval meant documentation and documentation meant time. The cutting tool worked on the 3rd attempt. 22 seconds of sparks that lit the vacuum around the hull like something celebrating, and then the blade bit and held and cut in a long, clean arc that took 4 minutes and 40 seconds and left a seam in the alien hull roughly the size of a standard residential door. The metal, or the thing that wasn't quite metal, folded inward rather than peeling away. Like skin. Nobody said anything about that. They went in. The inside of the ship was nothing like Jin-Su's map, which was to say it was like his map in the same way that a blueprint is like a house. Technically correspondent in structure, experientially a completely different thing. The corridors were wider than he projected. The gravity was lighter by a consistent margin that Mara's suit registered as approximately 78% of Earth standard. The lighting, if you could call it that, came from the walls themselves, a deep amber that pulsed at a rate just below the threshold of conscious perception, slow enough that you didn't notice the pulsing until you'd been in it for 3 minutes, and then you noticed it the way you notice a sound that's been present for so long it had seemed like silence. They like it dim, Diallo said. Methane-oxygen mix, Linus said. Methane planets run cooler. Cooler stars. Lower visible light bandwidth. Their eyes probably developed for lower lux. So we're bright to them. Like someone turned on a flashlight in a movie theater, yes. They had thermal on their visors. They had the map, such as it was. They had a mission profile that described its final objective as eliminate command capability and left the precise methodology deliberately open because the people who wrote it had been honest enough to admit they didn't know what a Vreth command structure looked like from the inside. What they had, more than anything, was 12 years of working together in the dark. Mara moved first. Diallo took the right flank. Jin-Su was on navigation, updating the map in real time on a tablet the size of a paperback, cross-referencing thermal gradient data with what he could see. Lena was watching the walls. They're aware of us, Lena said. She said the way you say it's going to rain, not with alarm, just with the information. How long? Since the hull breach. Maybe before. There's a surveillance architecture in the walls. I can see the sensor nodes, they're not hidden. They didn't think they'd need to hide them. Response time. Unknown. But look at the floor. Mara looked. The floor, the surface underfoot, which she had categorized as floor, had changed its texture in the 30 seconds since they'd entered. Not dramatically. Subtly. The way ice does when it starts to go wrong under you. A surface that was solid becoming a surface that is making a decision about whether to remain solid. It's adapting, Jin-Su said. Not surprised. He had put that in the notebook, circled it as one of his 12 wrong assumptions. Might adapt to intrusion, mechanism unknown. How fast? Mara said. Faster than us if we stop moving. They stopped stopping. The ship's interior had a logic to it once you stop trying to map it onto anything human. Human vessels, military, civilian, spatial, were designed around function as the organizing principle. Engines here, crew, quarters there, command at the top or center, everything else arranged in service of the movement from A to B. The Vreth vessel was organized around something else, something that felt, moving through it, less like function and more like hierarchy made physical, graduated architecture that intensified as you moved toward the center, corridors becoming more elaborate, materials becoming more refined, the amber light in the walls brightening and shifting toward a deeper, redder frequency. We're going the right way, Jin-Su said. How do you know? Said Lena. Because everything is getting more expensive. He was right. Every civilization that had ever built anything had done this. Put the most precious things at the most defended center. The Vreth were not an exception. They had just made the center very far away from the hull, and the path to it very confusing and the architecture itself an active participant in the confusion. Corridors branched and merged in patterns that were not random, but were not logical by any human definition of the word. Jin-Soo navigated through it using a principle he had articulated in the briefing as follow the gradient of increasing elaboration, and which Diallo had stared at for 3 seconds before saying, follow the fancy stuff, and Jin-Soo had said yes. They followed the fancy stuff. They encountered the first Vreth at the 11-minute mark. The intelligence had said bilateral symmetry, upright locomotion, 2 meters. The intelligence was technically correct and experientially useless. Standing in a corridor faced with the first non-human intelligence any human had ever encountered at a distance of 4 meters. Mara's brain performed a categorization process that she later described in debriefing as like trying to file something that doesn't fit any of your folders. The creature was tall, the full 2 meters, more in posture, and it moved the way things move when gravity is a suggestion rather than a rule, a fluidity that belonged to the 78%, to joints that had evolved in an environment that asked less of them. Its visual apparatus was wide, lateral, adapted to the low lux. It wore something. She couldn't call it armor or uniform with any confidence. It was both, and neither, a surface treatment rather than an addition. It had not expected them. That was the thing that mattered. In 11 minutes of moving through a ship on full alert, they had reached the first interior patrol, and the patrol had not been positioned for what they found. It had been positioned for what the Vreth expected. A strike from outside, a weapons discharge, the kind of response that a civilization watching humanity for 60 years would predict from a species that had spent those 60 years pointing missiles at each other. They had not positioned for 12 humans inside the hull with no missiles and considerable ingenuity. The encounter lasted 3 seconds. Diallo was already moving its second one. He had been trained by 3 different military traditions and had then spent 4 years unlearning everything they'd given him that wasn't useful and rebuilding from what remained. What remained was fast, was quiet, and was decisive. The Vreth patrol went down without generating any signal that the ship's own systems registered as an alarm, because the ship's systems were listening for the kinds of alarms they'd been programmed to recognize. This was not in their programming. We have maybe 4 minutes before that gets noticed, Lena said. She was crouching over the fallen Vreth with a scanner that was technically a medical device repurposed so far from its original function that its manufacturer would not have recognized it. Biology is remarkable. Copper-based blood analog. They're going to be very interesting to study. She stood up. For minutes, they moved. The second team, Tomas, alongside Elena Vasquez, Dr. Wei, and Marcus Okafor, had breached the hull on the vessel's opposite hemisphere 18 minutes after the first team. Their entry had been less clean. Not catastrophically, not in a way that changed the mission, but in the way that things go wrong when you're cutting a door into a ship that no human being designed, a seam that caught, a piece of hull that fell inward instead of folding, a 5-second moment where the structural integrity of the breach point was unclear and everyone held very still and didn't talk about what holding very still meant. Then it held. They went in. Tomas led. He was the kind of man who took up exactly the space he needed to, and not 1 centimeter more. Average height, average build, a face so consistently unremarkable that people who'd worked with him for years still sometimes search for his name, but he moved through the ship's corridors with a quality that was harder to name than it was to see, like watching a blade being carried. The thing is not in motion, but, without being told that it was made for cutting. Their objective was the secondary command relay. Jin-Soo's map had identified a communications node that served as the fleet coordination center, routing signals between the primary vessel and the 4 flanking ships. Disable it, and the fleet stopped talking to itself. A decapitation at the command level above was more complete, more decisive, but if you only got one of the 2 things done, you could win with the relay. You could probably win. The math was murkier in the probably zone, but murkier math was still math. The relay was deeper in than they'd expected. The ship was larger internally than externally, a fact that should have been physically impossible, and that Dr. Wei spent 3 corridors being quietly disturbed by before she made a conscious decision to accept it and move on. Non-Euclidean folded space is a known theoretical, she said to no one in particular. I don't want to know, Tomas said. You might need to know. I will accept that risk. Let's go. Back in the central corridor approach, Mara's team hit the 3rd Vreth patrol at the 20-minute mark. This one was different. 2 individuals, but positioned, not randomly, not on a circuit. Standing, waiting. The adaptation had begun. The ship knew something was wrong in its interior. It just didn't know what shape it was. The patrol was positioned for a human silhouette. That was the tell. The width of the corridor they were covering, the angle of their attention, they were expecting something roughly human-sized moving upright. Someone had communicated a description. The description was correct. The positioning was not. They were watching the corridor. They were not watching the ceiling. Mara signaled. Jin-Su went up. The corridor ceiling was that same strange material, slightly tacky under the suit's grip. He moved across it the way that training and the ship's reduced gravity conspired to make possible, and the patrol never adjusted its gaze from the corridor ahead, and then the patrol was down. They're learning, Linus said. Just not fast enough. How much further? Mara said. Jin-Su checked his tablet. He had been updating the map in real time for 20 minutes, correcting his 12 wrong assumptions as each one resolved into either worse or better news than he projected. 7 had been worse. 5 had been better. The net balance, he had calculated without sharing the calculation, was slightly favorable. He told people what they needed to know when they needed to know it. He had never found a use for the other kind of sharing. 300 meters. 2 more junctions. Then, a chamber. The thermal signature is concentrated. Whatever's in there is generating significant heat. Command structure, Diallo said. Or a very impressive boiler room, Jin-Su said. Diallo looked at him. Command structure, Jin-Su confirmed. The 3rd module, the smallest, 3 people, had a different mission entirely. Reza Tarani, Su Hyun Choi, and a woman who appeared in no documentation under any name and was listed only as Operator 9, had not breached the primary vessel. They were on a secondary vessel to the north, the one in polar orbit, the one that thermal analysis suggested housed the fleet's weapons coordination system. If the primary vessel's command structure was the brain, this secondary vessel was the trigger finger. Eliminating the command structure without silencing the trigger finger left 4 ships still capable of firing on Earth. Not the same as before. Without command, the targeting would be disrupted, possibly catastrophically from the Vreth perspective, but possible. Possible was not acceptable. Operator 9 had been given the secondary vessel's mission because she had read Jin-Su's map and made 2 observations. First, the secondary vessel had a simpler internal structure, less layered, more functional. Second, the weapons coordination system, if Jin-Su's gradient theory was correct, would be more central and more obvious. Easier to find, harder to reach. She had a solution for harder to reach that she had shared only with Reza and Su Hyun, and which she had described simply as "we go fast." They went fast. At the 26-minute mark in the primary vessel, Mara's team reached the chamber. It was the largest interior space they'd encountered. 4 stories of headroom that hadn't appeared in any thermal map because the thermal signature had read as concentrated, not as tall. The chamber was both tall and concentrated, the heat generating from a central structure that occupied the chamber's core with the self-evident importance of something that had never needed to worry about being found. The Vreth command structure was not a room. It was not a single individual. It was a collective. 5 beings connected to the central structure by interface points that ran along their dorsal axis, their wide eyes dim with the unfocus of deep processing, their bodies still in the specific stillness of minds that were somewhere else. The ship's command function was not located in any one of them, but in the space between them, in the collective cognitive architecture that the central structure facilitated. Remove the structure, you remove the processing space. Remove the processing space, and whatever was left was 5 very confused individuals in a very big room with no ship to command. Mara had 6 seconds to take this in. Then the chamber doors on the far side opened, and the Vreth security detail came through, and the 6 seconds ended, and the next 90 seconds were a different kind of thinking entirely. The kind that doesn't have a name either, but that the human brain had been doing since before it knew what naming was, the very old animal intelligence of survive this, survive this, survive this. She moved. They all moved. And 300 meters away, and 90 seconds later, Tomas's team reached the communication relay. And in polar orbit, Operator 9 went fast. The countdown on a Vreth schedule ticked below 2 hours. Outside the ship, the Earth turned and waited, and did not know yet that the sentence the Vreth had started was already being answered. The security detail numbered 8. Mara counted them in the first half-second and made the calculation that her brain made in situations like this without any particular effort from the part of her that thought in words, the part that ran pure pattern, pure geometry, pure movement. 8 bodies, a chamber 4 stories tall. 4 of her own people in positions that were wrong for this engagement, having been right for the previous 60 seconds of careful movement. The central structure, the command interface, was 40 meters from her current position and would require crossing open space to reach. The calculation resolved to the order of things needed to change. Lena, Jinsu. The structure, she said, and stepped in front of the security detail's line of advance with the precise energy of someone stepping into a gap in a physical structure. Not aggressive, not defensive, just present, just placed, blocking the geometry of the room, so that anything moving toward Lena and Jinsu had to move through her and Diallo first. Diallo was already there. She hadn't told him to be. He had made the same calculation. He was sometimes, she thought, the only person she'd ever met whose arithmetic reliably matched hers. The security detail was armed. The weapons were nothing any human engineer would have designed. Compact, bilateral, a technology that when fired produced a localized disruption field rather than a projectile, something that interfered with organic neural function at close range. They had learned about this technology from the signal's background data, from the spectral signature of what had happened in Karachi, from 14 analysts working backward from effect to mechanism in 72 hours of sleepless inference. The suits had shielding for it. Partial shielding. Good enough to survive 2 discharges before the shielding degraded. Mara had not mentioned this number to anyone before the mission because 2 has a way of feeling very small when you say it out loud. The first discharge hit her left arm. The suit held. She moved inside the second one before it could fire. And then she was in the kind of close physical work where the advantage fully switched and the Vreth security detail trained for the weapons gap between themselves and any possible intruder had no training at all for what happens when the intruder closes the gap entirely. Humans have been doing this specific thing, closing gaps, eliminating the weapon's effective range, making the fight a body problem rather than a technology problem for 40,000 years. The Vreth had not. This was not in their models of human behavior. Humans, in their 60 years of study, had seemed so thoroughly committed to shooting each other at distance that the Vreth had categorically failed to account for the subset that preferred otherwise. Diallo, in particular, preferred otherwise. He preferred it with a focused efficiency that was almost pleasant to watch if you were watching from outside the situation, which no one in that chamber was. 40 meters away, Lena and Jinsu reached the central structure. Lena put her hands on it. Not dramatically, pragmatically, the way she touched everything unfamiliar with the flat of her palms, and her full attention and the look on her face that other people might call awe but that she called data collection. The material was warm in a way that felt wrong. Wrong like a fever rather than wrong like a machine, and it pulsed at the same below-threshold frequency as the corridor lighting. That ambient pulse she'd stopped consciously noticing and was now noticing again because it was stronger here, more present, pressed against her palms like something listening. It's biological, she said. Part biological, Jinsu said. He was scanning. Hybrid architecture. Organic cognitive processing interfaced with synthetic relay. Like a brain in a machine. Like a brain in a machine. They looked at each other across the structure. The look lasted 1 second. In that 1 second, they had an entire conversation that would have taken 20 minutes to speak about what they were about to do, about what it meant, about the weight of it, and about the fact that the weight of it did not change what they needed to do. The 5 in the interface, Lena said, yes. Disconnecting them from the structure, well, yes. And the structure itself, yes. Jin-Soo reached into his kit and removed a device that was smaller than his fist, and that Mara had been briefed on by a physicist who had described its function in language that Jin-Soo had later translated for the rest of the team as it scrambles the signal, all the signals in a radius. The physicist had not specified what happened to biological components in that radius. Jin-Soo had asked. The physicist had said disruptive in a tone that meant the specific kind of disruption that doesn't recover. He set the device. Across the chamber, Mara's voice came through the comm, clear. She didn't say it with anything, just the word. Operational language. Clear. He looked at the 5 wreath connected to the structure. Still, somewhere else. Not yet knowing what was about to happen to the somewhere else they were in. He activated the device. The central structure went quiet in a way that a living thing goes quiet, a dropping off of presence rather than a switching off of mechanism, and the 5 wreath in their interfaces came back from wherever they'd been all at once. 5 pairs of wide, lateral eyes opening to a chamber that was full of very small, very determined humans, and a structure that was no longer a structure. The ship shuddered. One long, full-body shudder, the kind that a living thing makes when a significant part of it stops working, and then the amber light in the walls shifted, redder, deeper, something that registered on the suit's sensors as an alarm signal, and on the human instinctual level as exactly what it was. "We need to go," Diallo said. "Yes," said Mara. She was already moving. In the communications relay section, Tomas heard the shudder. He had been 30 seconds from the relay when it happened, and the shudder ran through the ship's floor and up through his boots and into his bones, and he knew what it meant without needing to be told. The command structure was down. The ship was a body without a brain. It would keep running. The autonomous systems would keep the lights on, the life support going, the orbit maintained, but it would not direct, not coordinate, not make decisions, which meant the secondary vessels had 30 seconds, maybe 60, before they recognized that the primary had gone silent and started doing things on their own initiative. He ran. The relay chamber was smaller than anything the first team had described. Practical. Functional. A room that existed entirely to serve its purpose with no architectural elaboration. Because this deep in a military vessel, the hierarchy of expense stopped mattering, and what mattered was throughput, and the relay's throughput, running at full capacity, was the voice of the fleet in 5 ships. He hit the relay with a shaped charge that Elena had built on the transport flight up, crouched behind a structural pillar with Marcus and DR. Way while the charge did its work, and then the relay was no longer a relay, and the fleet had no voice at all. 2 of the secondary vessels, in the seconds after the primary vessel's command went silent, fired their weapons. Not at Earth, at each other. A targeting error that the analysts would spend 6 months trying to fully explain and would eventually attribute to the relay's destruction mid-transmission, a signal that had been carrying targeting data interrupted and rerouted by its own disruption into something none of the ships had been programmed to interpret. The fleet's communication system in its death throws generating one final message that every vessel received, and none of them correctly understood. 2 Vreth vessels were damaged. One severely. The Earth didn't know any of this yet. The Earth was still counting down. Operator 9 finished what she'd started. The weapons coordination node on the polar vessel was in the vessel's core, which meant she'd had to go through the full depth of the ship to reach it, which was why she had described her approach as "we go fast." Fast was the only way. Fast before the ship's interior adapted. Fast before the security response, which on a vessel that had been watching the primary vessel's systems with professional attention and had noticed the first anomalies, caught up to 3 humans moving through its corridors like something the architecture hadn't been designed to stop. It hadn't been designed to stop them. The node was physically enormous. The polar vessel's main contribution to the fleet was weapons coordination, and the hardware for it occupied a chamber that put the primary vessel's relay to shame. Banks of interconnected processing architecture arranged in concentric rings that hummed at a frequency Su Hyun could feel in her molars. Operator 9 did not stop to admire it. She had brought more than Tomas had brought. She had brought what was necessary for something this size, and necessary was a category she had always applied generously because she had once lost a mission on the wrong side of necessary, and she did not repeat her losses. She placed. She set. She moved back out of the chamber with Reza and Su Hyun, and they were in the corridor when it went, and the polar vessel's weapons coordination node ceased to coordinate, and the 3 ships that were still intact and still armed were pointing all of their weapons at each other and at the sky and at nothing coherent at all, with no relay to tell them otherwise. The countdown reached 0. On the surface of the Earth, 6,400 broadcast networks had been running the countdown in one form or another since the signal first played. In Karachi, in the part of the city still standing, people watched the countdown on a cracked phone screen held up by a woman who had not left the street for 42 hours because leaving meant acknowledging that the street was real, that the crater 4 kilometers away was real, that the specific absence of things that had been there before was real, and the cracked screen was something to look at instead. The countdown reached 0. Nothing happened. The nothing was so loud it could be heard. Across 6,400 networks, in every language and time zone, people watched a number reach 0 and stayed completely still because the body does not know immediately what to do with anticipated catastrophe that does not arrive. The threat had been so certain, the countdown so precise, the crater so undeniable in its implications, that the brain had already written the next page and now found itself holding the pen with nothing left to write. 3 seconds of absolute global stillness. Then, someone in a broadcast booth in Seoul said something's wrong with the ships and pulled up the tracking data and was looking at it wrong, had it wrong, needed to adjust, and then had it right, and said it again differently, something is wrong with the ships. The 5 Vreth vessels were moving, not attacking. Moving, adjusting orbit in patterns that the tracking stations had no framework for, pulling back from geosynchronous, realigning toward an outbound trajectory. 2 of the 5 were visibly damaged, structural reads showing hull compromise across multiple sections. All 5 were communication silent. They were leaving. Inside the primary vessel, Mara was doing the thing she never talked about, which was making decisions at cost. The insertion modules had been designed for the ballistic approach, the arrival. The departure scenario had been listed in the briefing as under development, which was intelligence community language for we have some ideas and none of them are good. The good news was that with the ship's command structure down, no one inside the vessel was coordinating a response to their presence. The bad news was that with the ship's command structure down, the autonomous systems were running on a protocol that the analysts had labeled as emergency escalation, and which was doing things to the vessel's internal pressure that were not beneficial for humans who needed to stay inside the vessel a little longer. Egress options, Mara said. Lena was already pulling up the hull topology. We came in through E7. E7 is now on the ventral side, which is the wrong orientation for a launch separation. We go back out the same way, and we're pointed at the planet. Options. There's a maintenance bay on the dorsal face. Jin-Su's map has it. He circled it as wrong assumption number 3. Jin-Su, Mara said. It's there, Jin-Su said. I was wrong about the size. It's larger than I mapped it. Meaning the insertion module, if we can bring it around the hull, might fit. Might. How wrong is wrong about the size? It's either large enough by 4 meters or too small by 2. That's a 6-meter margin of error. Yes. Mara looked at her people. Diallo was covering the chamber entrance. Lena was running numbers. Jin-Su was looking at the tablet with the particular expression he wore when he was doing the math, and the math was not giving him anything he liked. All of them already knew what the next few minutes were going to look like. They had made it this far by being very honest with each other, and honesty in a situation like this didn't require words. "We moved to the maintenance bay," Mara said. "We call the module. We see if 4 meters or 2. And if 2, Diallo said. Then we improvise. We're very good at that," Diallo said. And he said it with the specific flat certainty of a man who had built his entire career on making improvise mean something other than give up. They moved. The ship shuddered again. The autonomous systems doing something to the drives. The beginning of the orbital reorientation that the fleet was executing without anyone to tell it not to. The amber light in the walls had gone fully red. Every step toward the maintenance bay was a step through a vessel that was in the process of becoming something other than what it had been 30 minutes ago. Its intelligence removed, its coordination severed, running now on the animal reflex of its own autonomous systems, which is a thing that felt, moving through it like walking through an argument rather than through a corridor. The maintenance bay was there, for meters of clearance above the tight scenario. More than 4. Nobody said anything about the margin of error. Jinsu updated his map without mentioning it. This was a form of kindness that all 12 of them had developed independently and never discussed and consistently practiced. The module came around. They got out. On Earth, in the moments after the countdown reached 0 and the ships began to move, Carver was in the monitoring room with his coffee and his 3rd hour of the same adrenaline cycle and his satellite phone and 12 transponder signals that were all still active, all still emitting, all still attached to people who were somewhere on or inside objects currently departing Earth orbit. He watched the transponders. He counted the signals the way you count something you care about. 12. All 12. He sat back. He put his coffee down. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. He was not a man given to visible emotion in professional contexts, which was how he had lasted this long in professional contexts that required the suppression of it. His hands were shaking. He let them. The Vreth fleet was leaving. The countdown had passed. The planet below him, under its perpetual cloud cover, was 8 billion people who didn't yet know that 12 other people had spent the last hour doing the most consequential thing any human beings had ever done, and that it had worked, and that the bill was still coming because nothing like this comes without a bill, and the bill would arrive in some form and some timing that none of them could yet see. But for this moment, this exact, narrow moment, the transponders were all 12, and the ships were leaving, and the coffee was cold, and Carver let his hands shake. Outside, the stars were where they'd always been. Indifferent, present, unchanged. They had no way to be impressed. They had seen this kind of thing before. The Vreth fleet reached the edge of the solar system in 11 days. Nobody on Earth watched them leave the way anyone had watched anything big happen before, without crowds, without cameras pointed at the sky, without the particular human instinct to gather in public spaces and experience enormity together. The gathering happened anyway, of course, in the piecemeal, improvised way that human beings have always gathered when the thing is too large for any one screen, any one broadcast, any one building. Streets filled in cities where streets had emptied 4 days earlier. People stood in the Karachi crater's outer ring, thousands of them, in a silence that the news crews kept failing to explain because the silence was not the absence of things to say. It was the presence of too many things said at once. The Vreth were leaving. Nobody knew why. That was the public version of the truth, and it stayed the public version for 22 days. Then, a journalist in Amsterdam published a photograph. Not a shocking photograph. No violence, no damage, no dead. A photograph of 12 people in a hangar, shot from a distance with a telephoto lens through a window that should have been covered but had not been covered due to an administrative error in a facility that was very good at not making administrative errors, and had made one once at exactly the wrong time. The photograph showed 12 people in non-uniform clothing, in conversation, in a space that contained equipment the journalist could not identify, near structures that bore no national insignia. The journalist published the photograph with a caption that consisted of one question: who are these people, and why are they here? Nobody answered the question for 16 more days. In the 38 days between the Vreth departure and the press conference, Mara's team debriefed. Debriefing is a clinical word for a process that is not clinical. It is a word for the thing that happens when people who have done something in a compressed, high-velocity urgency are asked to sit in a room and speak slowly about each moment of it, translating experience in a language in a way that often reveals how much of the experience exists in a register that language is not designed for. The analysts who ran the debriefings were good. They were patient. They asked precise questions, and they did not flinch when the answers were imprecise, which the answers often were, because the answers were about things for which precision had not been the relevant mode. Mara sat in the chair across from her debriefer and answered every question in the flat, complete sentences she used for official language. She described the chamber, the command structure, the device, the decisions. She did not use words like wait or wrong or necessary evil, because those are the kinds of words that belong to the hour after, not the debriefing chair. But late in the third session, the debriefer asked her, "What was the thing you most unexpected, the element you hadn't anticipated?" She thought about it for a moment that was slightly too long for a debrief. How confused they were, she said. The debriefer waited. The ones in the chamber, after the structure went down, they came back from wherever they were, and they were in a room full of things that shouldn't exist, doing things that shouldn't be possible, and she paused again. They were confused in a way I recognized. The way people look when they were certain, and then they weren't. I've seen that in humans. I've seen a lot. I didn't expect to see it she stopped. In a species that's been doing this for 4,000 years, she said. The debriefer wrote something. They thought they knew us, Mara said. 60 years of data, and they thought they knew us. She didn't say anything else for 30 seconds. What did they get wrong? The debriefer said. Mara looked at the window. The Norwegian winter outside it. The specific gray of a sky that has been gray so long it has become its own color. They studied what we built, she said. They didn't study what we'd failed to build and tried again. They didn't study the stuff in between. The gap between what humans intend and what humans do. That's where we live. She shrugged just slightly. That's where Spectre lives. The third team's debrief had a different texture. Operator 9 gave her session in a language that the analysts had to request a specific translator for. Not because she was incapable of speaking English, she was perfectly capable, but because certain things, she said, she preferred to say in a language that had words for them that English did not. The translator, a retired academic who had been pulled back into service for this specific occasion, told the analysts afterward that the session had been extensive and technically complete, and that there were several concepts she was expressing that I translated as best I could, but which don't travel well. The analysts noted this and moved on. They had gotten what they needed. The session was filed. The translator's observations were filed in a separate document labeled cultural and linguistic, which would be read by 3 people, 2 of whom would read it twice. Tomas gave his session in under 2 hours, which was a record. The relay went down on schedule, he said. The secondary vessel's targeting was disrupted. We extracted. I have nothing to add. The debriefer looked at him. Nothing else to include. Yes. Nothing about the experience of being inside an alien spacecraft. Tomas considered this for a moment. He had the patience of someone who had learned that patience was a form of force, not absence of movement, but perfectly withheld movement. It was large, he said. That's all. It was large, and it smelled like a fire that had gone out very recently. The gravity was off. He paused. The Vreth moved beautifully. I won't say it otherwise. They're very well designed for what they do. We were better designed for what we did. He stood up. I think we're done. They were done. The press conference was held in Geneva, which was chosen because it was the closest thing humanity had to a neutral location for significant announcements, and because the UN building had the largest secure briefing room in the Northern Hemisphere, and because nobody could agree on any other city for 12 hours, and they had eventually accepted Geneva by exhaustion rather than consensus. The Director General of the United Nations spoke first. She was a woman who had spent 40 years learning how to say difficult things in rooms full of people who didn't want to hear them, and She said the necessary things with the clarity they deserved, and if her voice was not entirely steady for the first 3 sentences, it found its steadiness by the 4th, and held it. She confirmed that the Vreth fleet had departed under circumstances that involved a direct human action inside the primary vessel. She confirmed that the action had been covert, coordinated, and multinational. She confirmed that the participants were alive. She did not say Spectre. The name was still sealed, would be sealed for another 4 years, would eventually emerge not through any official announcement, but through the slow archaeological work of journalism that always, eventually, reaches what it's looking for. She said, "The individuals responsible for this action will not be publicly identified for reasons of their ongoing security and operational continuity. They have been recognized by the 7 nations that coordinated this response at the highest level of distinction those nations can offer. Those distinctions, like the individuals themselves, will remain classified." She opened the floor to questions. The questions were what questions always are when humans are confronted with something they cannot fit into any existing framework. Large, repetitive, slightly beside the point, circling the real question that nobody was formulating correctly because the real question was enormous, and getting a precise grip on it was difficult when your hands were still shaking from the near miss. The real question was, what do we do now? What they did, in the 30 months that followed, was the thing humans had always done with the experience of a threat that did not complete itself. They rebuilt what had been destroyed, Karachi, slowly, in the specific way of a city that is not simply fixing damage, but remaking itself around a new understanding of its own geography. They argued, as they had always argued, about resource allocation and political credit and historical narrative and who deserved recognition for what. They built things. They started new arguments about the things they were building. They formed committees, and quietly in a mountain in Norway and 2 other facilities that will not be named here, they trained. Not for the Vreth specifically, not to repeat the mission, which had been so contingent on its particular circumstances that any attempt to replicate it would be the kind of mistake that mistakes make. They trained for the general case, which was the case they now knew existed and had always existed, that there were others out there, that the others had timelines and motivations and technology that made conventional human military thinking look like a map of the wrong continent, and that the only reliable advantage humanity had ever demonstrated against any of it was the same advantage it had demonstrated against every other thing that had ever tried to end it. The gap. The space between what humans intend and what humans do. The place where Spectre lived. The 12 were not always 12 anymore. Lena took a position at a research institution that she was not allowed to name and that she described to her family as consulting. Jin-Soo spent 14 months in a location not recorded in any document and returned with a notebook that he gave to the facility's library under a classification level that required a different key. 2 of the 12 accepted promotions that moved them sideways into roles that were not operational and that they accepted without visible complaint and with a visible attitude of people who understood the long game and were playing it. Mara stayed in the mountain. She was asked, in an interview with a journalist whose questions she had agreed to answer for reasons she kept to herself, what she thought would happen next. "They'll come back," she said. The journalist, a careful person, serious, who had spent 3 months earning this 15-minute conversation, wrote this down. The Vreth. Maybe the Vreth. Maybe something else. She looked at the window. Window, different city, same gray sky. The universe is not designed for comfort. It doesn't owe us a period of peace between incidents. Does that frighten you? She thought about this question the way she thought about all questions that were trying to find out something specific, by looking at what the question was actually asking rather than what the words of it said. The journalist wasn't asking about fear. The journalist was asking whether what had happened had changed her, whether walking out a ship that no human had ever walked into had rearranged something in the person who'd done it. The answer to that question was yes, obviously, in the way that every significant thing rearranges the person it happens to. But that wasn't the part that was useful to say. "We did something in that ship," she said. something that their civilization's entire model of us said wasn't possible, because they were working from a model that was 60 years old and built on observations of humanity that were technically accurate and fundamentally wrong. She straightened in her chair, not for the interview, just because it was the right posture for the thing she was saying. Humanity is not what we look like from the outside. We're not our weapons. We are not our governments. We are not the thing that fits in any category they could construct from 60 years of watching. The thing that frightens them, and they're frightened whatever the Vreth show publicly, whatever posture their fleet holds on its way home. The thing that actually frightens them is that they don't know what we are. And they're right not to know, because we don't entirely know either. And that uncertainty, that gap between what we appear to be and what we are capable of, she paused. That's not a vulnerability, she said. That's the weapon. In a Vreth Dominion, at a distance of 4 light years from Earth that the Dominion's vessels have been covering for 8 months, the report that had been compiling since the primary vessel's command structure went silent was formally presented to the Dominion's coordinating assembly. The report was not declassified. It was not shared publicly. Within the Dominion's information architecture, it existed only in the highest security tier, visible only to the 43 individuals who constituted the coordinating assembly and the 6 advisors those individuals trusted entirely. The report was 200 pages long. Its conclusion section was 3 pages. The final paragraph of the conclusion section had been written and rewritten 11 times before the reporting officer accepted the current version. Not because the language was difficult, but because the finding it described was the kind of finding that a civilization that had not encountered it before has no comfortable way to articulate. It said, in the Vreth language that has no direct translation, but which the 6 human linguists who would eventually read a copy, decades later, would render approximately as, this species does not behave in accordance with the parameters by which we predicted it, is not more powerful than we estimated, is not more advanced. It is stranger. There's a quality in the gap between their stated capabilities and their demonstrated capabilities that our models cannot currently account for, and our models have never previously failed to account for a comparable variable. We recommend immediate moratorium on engagement. We recommend extensive reassessment. We recommend that the primary question, what are these people, be treated not as a preliminary inquiry to the mission, but as the mission itself. We were certain. We were wrong. The recommendation of this report is that we not again mistake those 2 things for the same condition. The 43 members of the coordinating assembly read this. Then they read it again. Then they did what governing bodies do when they receive information that contradicts the entire framework within which they have been operating. They argued about it for a long time, and the argument was fierce and long, and ultimately resolved not by consensus, but by the weight of one simple fact that nobody in the chamber could refute. They had sent 5 ships and a countdown to a species they considered resolved, and the species had sent 12 people and come home. The moratorium passed. The Vreth were patient. They could wait. They could study. They could rebuild their models with the corrected variables and the new data and the understanding that they had been, for the first time in their 4,000-year history of expansion, surprised. They would not be surprised again. Somewhere in a mountain in Norway, in a facility that did not exist in any public record, 12 people, or the 10 of them who were still operationally active, and the 2 who were in adjacent roles that were still operational in different ways, were not sleeping. Or not sleeping much. They were training, studying, updating their own maps with 12 wrong assumptions corrected and 12 new ones identified and circled in ink. Somewhere, in a universe that was neither designed for comfort nor owed anyone a period of peace between incidents, the next thing was already happening. It always was. They were ready. They were getting ready. With humans, the 2 were hard to distinguish from the outside. That was, as it turned out, the point.